Okay, do let me know if you can see that.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So brilliant. Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you all for attending this session this afternoon. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project that Oxford University Press has launched. We haven't actually gone as far as to collect any data so far, so I'm just going to be introducing the project a little bit and also talking about the rationale for it as well. And of course, in detail, talk a bit about the kind of thinking that's gone into it so far in terms of assessment for learning and how this influences our understanding of what a diagnostic test should be. So, first of all, just to give a little bit of context of assessment for learning, if you're not completely familiar with this, assessment for learning is more to do with pedagogy than assessment itself. It's a pedagogical approach which tends to use information from multiple sources, including teaching and testing. And it can be from observation or student self-evaluations, classwork, informal or other kinds of tests. And it uses this information to actually influence the classroom activity, pedagogy, and hopefully the learning of the students themselves. So it's much more about integrating assessments into learning. So for this reason, we often contrast assessment for learning with assessment of learning. So think of it in terms of formative rather than summative, often informal rather than formal, and more specifically interested in learning processes rather than learning outcomes as such. And then in terms of putting this into action, for feedback, well, of course, for assessment for learning to be effective, it has to be based on very effective feedback as well, which is why you can see feedback in the middle of this triangle here. But in order for feedback to be effective, then other aspects of classroom teaching and learning actively need to support it, and ideally vice versa as well. And there are three key classroom practices which tend to encourage students to engage with the kind of feedback that they receive. And this, of course, is first one is diagnostics, which is finding out where learners are in relation to their overall learning journey. The learning intentions or learning objectives, as we often call them at Oxford University Press. So making clear what is being learnt and why and at what stage of the journey as well. And then also having very clearly stated success criteria as well. So understanding what performance looks like in terms of the learning that we're trying to assist students with. And in terms of feedback as well, we identified 7 specific elements of effective feedback that we're trying to take into account in terms of assessment for learning. So the first of these is that the feedback should always be specific and clear. So ineffective feedback can be too general, for example, such as you should try harder or improve your grammar. Or it may be a little bit too abstract as well, such as something like 7 out of 10. Which may give an overall impression of proficiency, but doesn't really qualify as diagnostic feedback. So one approach is a kind of medals and missions approach that we often talk about at OUP. In which feedback consists of identifying what learners have done well, and also simultaneously providing specific guidance on what they ought to be doing next. So, for example, we could say that you've successfully identified key points in a summary, but maybe you could provide a broader range of vocabulary to avoid repeating the same adjective, for example. Additional feedback to a student might be, what could you do to replace the word exciting? For example. So offering a kind of feedback that tries to get the student to reflect on their content rather than just providing explicit concrete examples. Second is that it should be well timed. So when is the best time to actually provide feedback? I mean, this may vary, of course, but a general rule of thumb is that it should be as soon after an assessment as is possible. In more productive tasks, such as speaking and writing, of course, it would be preferable to allow the task to move to completion before offering specific feedback. In addition to this, it's also worth mentioning that time should be factored in to actually allow students to act upon the feedback they receive. So not just giving the feedback and then not referring to it again, but actively creating either space within a class to examine and act upon the feedback, or to provide additional scaffolding for independent learning so that students are able to act upon this feedback in an independent setting. So as previously touched upon, the third point is that it should be linked to learning intentions, of course. So students need to be presented with the success criteria. So this is about ensuring alignment between tests, curriculum, and pedagogy. So we also want to ensure that the feedback they receive is consistent, that students know what to expect, and also that they don't end up getting too much feedback for them to process. The fourth point is that the feedback should be task focused as well. So not specifically focused on the learner, but more elaborating on what has been done well in relation to the task and also what can be improved. This is quite useful for avoiding excessive emotional reactions to the feedback, that students might feel that the feedback is too personally oriented towards them. It's also important that the fifth point, that the feedback be level appropriate as well. So level appropriate doesn't just mean appropriate to the language level, of course, but appropriate to the stage the learner has reached in terms of their learning goals. So whether this be giving examples, whether it be scaffolding, whether it be reminder prompts, whether it be encouraging reflection, will of course depend on where the learner is in their particular learning journey. And this kind of level appropriate prompt can, of course, act across CFR levels, for example. So you could give examples or scaffolds or reminders at levels, from A1 through to C2, depending on the learning objectives. And then, of course, the sixth point is that it should be strategically focused as well. So the aim is for students to become more self-regulating with this kind of feedback. So high-level students would benefit from strategies designed to help them become more self-regulating, whereas maybe lower-level students might might focus better on strategies which are more oriented towards scaffolding, for example. And the idea being that students then become more adept at identifying their own sources of error within their work. And the seventh and final point on this particular slide is that the feedback should be actionable and achievable. So if feedback is sufficiently specific and embedded in the curriculum and related to the learning objectives, then it's likely that the feedback given to them will be much more actionable than more generic feedback as well. So teachers must also consider how the feedback would stimulate action on the part of the students. And again, as I said, allow time for this to be undertaken as part of the course. So this leads on to the kind of types of assessment that can have a beneficial effect on learning as well. And so for this reason, we've been thinking a lot about diagnostic assessments at OUP too. So what exactly is a diagnostic assessment? So, I mean, a diagnostic test is any kind of assessment practice, really, which allows teachers to provide this kind of specific and detailed feedback that we've just been talking about, and that it is very much focused on learners' strengths and weaknesses. And it's also about providing a test which is very centered on language areas which are intrinsic to the particular course or where students are in that learning journey. So there's often a bit of a tension between creating a sort of generic test for a particular course or level and a diagnostic test which is more focused on specific language areas. So feedback in relation to a diagnostic test ought to be very focused to those specific language areas. And the students, when they're taking a diagnostic test, should be aware of the kinds of language areas that the diagnostic test will provide them with information on. And as we said, the nature of the feedback should be specific as well. It's got to go beyond that kind of good or well done summative approach to performance, or even just providing individual scores for reading or grammar. Again, it has to go deeper than that. So within, say, grammar or within reading, you've got to think about the kinds of grammar or the reading purposes, actually. So for what reading purpose are we trying to get at in our particular course of instruction? Is it reading for gist? Is it reading for comprehension? Are we trying to identify the main information? Are we trying to identify the writer's attitude or point of view, for example? Okay, so when evaluating some of the literature around diagnostic tests, we've also been looking at the kind of guiding principles that we can go about creating a diagnostic test by. And of course, Alana Shahami has written on this. It's quite old now, but we still found this to be particularly useful in terms of guiding our understanding of diagnostic assessment. And so they themselves should always be evaluated in terms of the degree to which they provide teachers and students with information on the learning, and then the extent to which that it can actually provide information to then inform decisions as well. So it's about providing information which is actually usable for both teachers and learners. And then she also goes on to say this feedback should be ample, detailed, and innovative if possible, and of course work across a variety of language dimensions. And interestingly, she also says the 4 skills as well, so reading, speaking, writing, and listening, although it is perfectly possible to provide diagnostic assessments on more finely grained areas of language proficiency, even as far as pronunciation or specific grammatical competencies as well. And then more recently, we've got Harding et al.'s, Luke Harding's 2015 framework on a theory of diagnosis. They forward this as a kind of tentative framework for a theory of diagnosis, rather than offering it as a kind of how-to approach. But nonetheless, they did articulate a series of 5 principles, which we've got here as well. So first of all, it's not the test which diagnoses, it's the user of the test itself. So the instruments, of course, should be sufficiently finely grained and well designed to actually provide the kinds of information required within the particular classroom setting. But then, of course, what they then do with that information is entirely up to the teachers and the learners themselves. So it's those users who then use that instrument for diagnostic purposes. So the test should be user-friendly and suitable for the administration. So they should be targeted, discrete, and efficient in order to assist teachers in making a diagnosis as cleanly and as quickly and as reliably as possible. So they should be suitable for administration in the classroom, and then designed or assembled with, of course, to possibly existing tools that are available to teachers by those teachers who have actually been trained in how to use them effectively, so that the kind of rich and detailed feedback that they get, they know what to do with, and they are well immersed in that kind of assessment for learning practice. So they do need to be designed with specific diagnostic purposes in mind. I can't stress that enough, because of course, the more generic you make a test, then you're going to have fewer items per learning objective or particular language points. And if you have few items per language point, it becomes increasingly difficult to make diagnostic decisions or to obtain diagnostic information. Potentially, you could do that for a class if you have, of course, say 30 students and 1 item around a specific language area, but then it would become extremely difficult to provide individually focused level feedback. So it does make sense to have fewer language areas and then more items per language area. Okay, and then allows for 4 diagnostic stages, which include observation, initial assessment, intervention, and decision making. So of those 4 steps, it's usually the case that when diagnostic assessment does occur, it tends to occur primarily beginning with point C, intervention. Whereas realistically, a diagnostic test, when done by a classroom teacher in a particularly situated setting, should begin with observation. So it might be the case that a teacher notices that their class may be particularly weak on 1 language point. And maybe before they actually give a diagnostic test, they may conduct an initial assessment, whether verbal or with a few smaller activities, just to get a sense of whether or not they're correct, and get a sense of whether or not a larger scale diagnostic intervention is actually necessary in the first place. So, and then of course, once they go on and perform that intervention and actually collect data associated with the language areas, they can then use this to make decisions on the basis of the data that they've collected. Okay, and then of course, finally, and really important, diagnostic assessment should relate to some future treatment. So it's not just about the actual testing process itself, it's about the why. Why do you need to give this particular diagnostic test? And what are you going to do with the information once you've obtained it? So that's really, really important for diagnostic assessment. So it does tend to be low stakes. So we're not talking about using information to make decisions about streaming. So, I mean, it is common in, say, either the literature or for teachers maybe to confuse a placement test with a diagnostic test. But really, the literature should and does, in the best situations, actually differentiate between them. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just introduce you briefly to OUP's diagnostic test that we have so far designed for a key market, which is Poland. And at the moment, what we're going to do is actually roll out this particular test as a kind of initial study. We're not going as far as to call it a pilot at the moment. So we've designed a test which includes use of English, reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And we've designed it to fit within existing lesson parameters. So for example, this particular marketplace that we're looking at has well, the stakeholders that we work with have lessons in 40-minute slots. So we were keen to ensure that any diagnostic test could be sufficiently flexible to take place within either 1 or 2 40-minute lesson slots. And then, of course, allowing the teachers to either select the parts of the diagnostic test that they wish to use or use the full suite. So if they wish to use all 5 parts, they could then stretch this across 2 classes. If they want to select, say, use of English, reading and listening, it's something that could be achieved within a 40-minute time slot. Okay, and then what we've also done is create a feedback framework as well. So actually, it's worth just going back to the previous slide a moment, just to show you that actually the most bespoke element of this test is the use of English with the 23 option multiple choice questions. So whereas reading and listening tends to provide feedback on reading purpose and listening purpose, respectively, use of English can provide the feedback at the kind of learning objective or language area level. So if we have 20 items, what we're saying to teachers is it's best to have no more than, say, 4 particular language areas that you want to test your students on, and then to have 5 items per learning area. And we've designed this specifically so that when it comes to data analysis, we have sufficient number of items per language learning area so that we can actually provide the teachers with the specific feedback for them. So the framework, the feedback framework that we've designed allows teachers to collate the raw data from the students and then enter that into a matrix and then automatically generates feedback as well. And so the feedback can be generated both for the individual learner and also for the teacher at the classroom level. And so what can be generated is a report that provides information on each of the language learning areas for use of English. So for example, if we have 4 language learning areas such as past simple, past continuous, subject and object questions, or past simple versus past continuous, a teacher might look at this information and gain a very clear picture of where the students are stronger and weaker. So we might say that they're quite good at individually forming the past continuous or individually forming the past simple, but they're weaker on knowing when to use past simple versus past continuous. So immediately a teacher could take this information and realize that actually the class needs a bit more practice on understanding when to use past simple versus past continuous. Okay, and then for reading, we can get very similar feedback if we have items that are pre-tagged against reading purpose. So for example, reading to identify genre or audience, or the writer's purpose, reading to identify main information, or reading to identify attitude and point of view, we can provide class level feedback for this as well. And likewise, listening. Oh, sorry, I didn't include that as well. But then for the individual level students, we can also generate a report which includes some overall scores and percentages, although this is something that is not diagnostic. It's something that we want to include because this is something that individual marketplaces have told us that they still want to have, even in a diagnostic test. So we're able to provide scores and percentages and breakdowns for use of English reading and listening, for example, but we also want to provide further guidance for individual learners as well. So we're at the moment, we've got a tool which can generate summative statements around, say, grammar or reading or listening. So you're doing very well, for example. And what we're doing at the moment is dividing the class level data into 3 levels, depending on their performance. So low, middle, and high. So they get feedback depending on which of those 3 levels that the individual student falls into. And then the advice that they give, or the kind of strategic feedback to the students, will vary according to level as well. So low level students at the moment, or students who are the weakest of those three levels, tend to get strategies which are more about awareness raising. So trying to make students aware of the kind of language learning areas, or the reading or listening purposes. With the middle level, we're focusing on retention level strategies. So trying to memorize particular grammar points, or trying to inculcate practices about good reading practices to help students identify particular purposes, or writer's attitude, for example. And then for the high level, we're trying to provide strategies which are more focused on sort of freer language production. So if they're focused on grammar, then it's about using the grammar that they've learned in writing or speaking to solidify what they've demonstrated learning. And the reason we're doing that is because the literature seems to indicate that actually in diagnostic assessments, the kind of feedback and advice given to high-level students is a little impoverished in comparison to low-level or mid-level students. So that's something that we didn't want to overlook. We still wanted to provide feedback to high-level students as well. And so we're trying to generate advice based on the kind of literature that we found and best practice that we found so far. So we are doing research on this at the moment. So we want to find out how the diagnostic test functions as it's currently been designed, and what teachers and students think of the feedback they receive from this diagnostic test. So we've generated a series of research questions that we want to look at. So what are teachers' perspectives of the test content and the design, the feedback framework that we've created, and we also want to find out to what extent the feedback that they received subsequently influenced their pedagogy as well. And likewise, we want to gain perspectives of students as well. So what are their perspectives of the test content and the design, the feedback they receive, and to what extent did the feedback influence their learning as well? So we're soon going to roll out this research. We're going to progress this in 3 phases in Poland, as I previously mentioned. So we're currently negotiating with a couple of stakeholders to identify a group of test takers. We're looking at about 150 to take the diagnostic test in Poland. And so we will ask for students to take the test. We will use the data to generate the feedback, both of the individual students and the teachers involved in the study. And we will provide them with that feedback from the test. And then we will ask them, maybe about a week or 2 later, we'll ask teachers also to score some samples of writing as well, which we've already gathered using the new rating scales that we've developed for the diagnostic tests. And also we've developed a separate diagnostic framework for writing as well. And the third phase, we're going to conduct some follow-up interviews with teachers and survey with students up to 150, if we can actually succeed with our data collection, to investigate further the kind of perspectives of the usefulness of the feedback for teaching and learning. And so we hope to use these findings to further refine our approach to diagnostic assessment. So hopefully maybe we can actually develop the feedback framework a little bit more, the kind of strategies we include in it, and as part of our ongoing wider commitment to assessment for learning. And one day potentially all this research could hopefully lead towards the development of an Oxford diagnostic test as well. Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take some questions now. So I'm just going to